There is a quiet kind of pain that doesn't leave bruises, doesn't raise voices, and doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It doesn't come from abuse or cruelty in the obvious sense. It comes from absence, from the things that never happened, from the comfort that was never offered, the emotions that were never acknowledged, the safety that was never felt. Emotional neglect as a child isn't about what was done to you, it's about what wasn't. And because of that, it's one of the hardest wounds to recognize, explain, or even believe is real. When you grow up emotionally neglected, no one points to a clear moment and says, "That's where it went wrong." There is no single memory you can hold up as proof. Instead, there is a vague sense of emptiness that follows you into adulthood, a feeling that something is missing, even when life looks fine on the surface. You may struggle to explain why you feel disconnected, why relationships feel confusing, or why you carry a constant sense of being slightly out of place in the world. As a child, you learned early that your emotions didn't matter much, not because anyone explicitly said so, but because no one asked. No one noticed when you were overwhelmed, scared, or hurting. You learned to self-soothe before you even knew what that meant. You learned to sit with your feelings alone, to figure things out internally, to not bother others with your inner world. And over time, this became normal. Silence became familiar. Emotional distance became safe. What makes emotional neglect especially damaging is that it teaches you to doubt your own needs. You don't grow up thinking, "I deserved more." You grow up thinking, "This is just how it is." You normalize the lack of warmth. You minimize your pain. You tell yourself that other people had it worse, that nothing truly bad happened, that you should be grateful. And in doing so, you learn to dismiss yourself long before anyone else does. As you get older, this neglect doesn't disappear, it transforms. It shows up as difficulty identifying your own emotions. You might feel overwhelmed but not know why. You might feel empty instead of sad, numb instead of angry. When someone asks how you feel, your mind goes blank, not because you don't feel anything, but because you were never taught how to recognize or express it. Emotional language was never modeled for you. You were left to guess. Relationships become especially complicated. You crave closeness, but intimacy feels unfamiliar, even threatening. When someone tries to get close to you emotionally, part of you stiffens. You don't know how to receive care without suspicion. You may feel uncomfortable being seen, supported, or prioritized because deep down it contradicts everything you learned as a child. Love feels uncertain. Attention feels temporary. And vulnerability feels like a risk you were never trained to take. Often emotionally neglected children grow into adults who are incredibly independent. On the surface, this looks like strength. You handle things on your own. You don't ask for help. You pride yourself on being low maintenance and self-sufficient. But underneath that independence is a quiet belief that relying on others will only lead to disappointment. So you don't lean. You don't reach. You carry everything yourself, even when it becomes heavy. There is also a strange loneliness that comes with emotional neglect, not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that exists even in rooms full of people. You can be surrounded by friends, family, partners, and still feel unseen, still feel like no one really knows you, because knowing you would require emotional attunement, and that's something you've rarely experienced. So you keep parts of yourself hidden, not consciously, but instinctively. You may struggle with self-worth without understanding why. There is a deep, unspoken question inside you. Am I enough? And no matter how much you achieve, how competent you become, or how much validation you receive, that question never fully goes away. Because emotional neglect doesn't teach you that you are unworthy, it teaches you that your inner world is invisible, and invisibility slowly erodes your sense of value. Another painful effect is how you relate to other people's emotions. You may become hyper-attuned to others, always reading moods, anticipating reactions, adjusting yourself to avoid conflict or rejection. Or you may do the opposite, emotionally withdraw, shut down, keep conversations surface level. Both are survival strategies learned in childhood. Both are attempts to protect yourself from emotional abandonment. Anger is especially difficult. Many emotionally neglected children were never allowed to express anger safely, or they learned that strong emotions were ignored or inconvenient. As adults, this can lead to suppressed anger that turns inward as self-criticism, shame, or anxiety. You may feel frustrated with yourself for being too sensitive or too much, without realizing that your emotions were never given space to exist in the first place. Perhaps the most painful part is that emotional neglect doesn't give you clear permission to grieve. There was no obvious loss, no dramatic event, just a childhood where something essential was missing, and grieving something that never existed feels confusing. How do you mourn the comfort you never received, the validation you never felt, the sense of safety you were never taught to expect? So you go through life carrying an unnamed sadness, a quiet ache, a feeling that you're always catching up emotionally, always learning lessons later than others. You may feel behind in relationships, behind in self-understanding, behind in emotional confidence. And because emotional neglect is invisible, you may blame yourself for these struggles instead of recognizing them as the natural result of what you lacked. Healing from emotional neglect is not about blaming parents or rewriting the past. It's about finally giving yourself what you didn't receive, learning to notice your emotions instead of dismissing them, learning to validate your feelings instead of questioning them, learning to ask for support without guilt. These things don't come naturally. They feel awkward, uncomfortable, even wrong at first. But that discomfort is not failure. It's unfamiliarity. You begin to realize that your difficulty isn't weakness, it's adaptation. You survived an environment that didn't emotionally respond to you by becoming self-contained. You learned to live without mirrors for your inner world. And now, as an adult, you are learning how to see yourself for the first time. That process is slow. It's messy. And it requires patience you were never taught to have for yourself. And this is why it sucks to be emotionally neglected as a child. Not because it ruins you, but because it quietly shapes you in ways that take years to untangle. Because it teaches you to live without emotional nourishment, and then asks you to figure out why you're starving later in life. Because it leaves you learning how to feel, connect, and trust from scratch, long after childhood has ended. As you move through adulthood with this history, you may notice a pattern of self-abandonment that feels automatic. You put your needs last without consciously deciding to. You minimize your feelings before anyone else has the chance to. When something hurts, your first instinct is not to ask for comfort, but to rationalize the pain away. You tell yourself you're being dramatic, sensitive, or unreasonable. This inner voice didn't come from nowhere. It was shaped in an environment where your emotions were not reflected back to you, where silence became the response you learned to expect. Because no one consistently responded to your emotional needs as a child, you learn to become emotionally invisible to yourself. You may struggle to know what you want, what you need, or what you feel in the moment. Decisions feel heavy, not because you lack intelligence, but because you were never guided to trust your internal signals. When your feelings weren't acknowledged growing up, your inner compass never fully formed. So now, even small choices can feel overwhelming, as if you're guessing instead of knowing. This often shows up in relationships as confusion between attachment and love. You may attach to people who are emotionally distant, unavailable, or inconsistent, not because you enjoy being neglected, but because it feels familiar. Emotional distance feels like home. When someone is warm, attentive, and emotionally present, part of you may feel uneasy or suspicious. You wait for the withdrawal. You brace yourself for the moment the care disappears. Sometimes you even pull away first, just to stay in control of the loss. There is also a deep fear of being a burden. You hesitate to express sadness, disappointment, or need because you learned early that emotions were inconvenient or ignored. So you become the easy one, the one who doesn't complain, the one who listens more than they speak. And while people may appreciate this version of you, it comes at a cost, because the real you, the one with needs and emotions, remains unseen and unmet. Emotionally neglected children often grow into adults who are incredibly empathetic toward others but deeply harsh toward themselves. You understand everyone else's struggles, make excuses for their behavior, and extend compassion easily. But when it comes to yourself, that softness disappears. You expect yourself to cope, to move on, to not need too much. This imbalance isn't a personality flaw, it's a learned response. You were trained to turn empathy outward because it was never modeled inward. You might notice how uncomfortable it feels when someone asks you to talk about your childhood, not because it was obviously terrible, but because it feels emotionally blank. You struggle to explain what was wrong. There were no dramatic scenes, no obvious abuse, no clear villain, just a lack of emotional presence. And because society often equates trauma with visible harm, you may doubt your own experience. You may wonder if you're exaggerating, if you're remembering things incorrectly, if you're allowed to feel hurt at all. This self-doubt is one of the most damaging effects of emotional neglect. It teaches you not only to question your feelings, but to distrust your own reality. And when you don't trust your inner experience, you become vulnerable to being defined by others. You look outward for validation, for direction, for a sense of worth. You may overvalue other people's opinions or feel destabilized by criticism because you never developed a solid internal sense of being emotionally held. Over time, this can lead to anxiety, depression, or a persistent sense of emptiness, not because something is inherently wrong with you, but because emotions that are not acknowledged don't disappear, they go underground. They show up as tension in the body, as chronic fatigue, as overthinking, as emotional numbness. Your system learned to shut down feelings for survival, and now it doesn't know how to turn them back on safely. Healing from emotional neglect often begins with something that feels surprisingly difficult, allowing yourself to have needs, not just in theory but in practice. Letting yourself feel disappointed without justifying it. Letting yourself rest without earning it. Letting yourself want closeness without shame. These acts may feel uncomfortable, even selfish at first, because they challenge the rules you learned in childhood. But discomfort doesn't mean you're doing something wrong, it means you're doing something new. You slowly learn to name your emotions, even when they feel unclear or messy. You learn to sit with feelings instead of rushing to explain them away. You learn that emotions don't need permission to exist. They don't need to be logical, productive, or convenient. They just need space. And giving yourself that space is not indulgence, it's repair. As this awareness grows, there may be anger that surfaces. Anger at what you didn't receive. Anger at how long it took to understand why life felt so hard. This anger is not something to fear or suppress. It's a sign that you're finally recognizing that your emotional needs mattered all along, that something important was missing, and that it's okay to acknowledge that loss. With time, you begin to build an internal relationship that you never had externally. You become more attentive to your inner world, more responsive to your own signals. You start to notice when you're overwhelmed before you shut down. You start to offer yourself reassurance instead of criticism. This doesn't erase the past, but it changes how much power it has over your present. And slowly, the emptiness begins to soften, not because it disappears completely, but because it's no longer ignored. You stop expecting yourself to function without emotional support. You stop pretending that neglect didn't affect you. You allow yourself to grow emotionally, even if it feels later than it should. Healing doesn't mean becoming someone new, it means finally becoming someone who is emotionally present with themselves. This is the long-term cost of being emotionally neglected as a child. Not a broken life, but a delayed one. A life where emotional understanding has to be learned consciously instead of absorbed naturally. And while that journey is painful, it is also deeply human. Because the moment you begin to recognize what was missing, you also begin to give it to yourself. And that is where real healing starts. As this healing deepens, you may start to notice something subtle but powerful. You no longer feel the need to disappear inside yourself. For much of your life, disappearing felt safer than being seen. It protected you from disappointment, from unmet expectations, from the quiet ache of hoping someone would emotionally show up and watching them fail to do so. But as you learn to emotionally show up for yourself, that instinct to vanish slowly loses its grip. You begin to understand how much of your personality was shaped around avoiding emotional needs, how often you stayed quiet instead of expressing hurt, how often you adapted instead of asking for change, how often you convinced yourself that needing less made you easier to love. Emotional neglect taught you that connection was conditional, that closeness came only when you were undemanding, calm, and emotionally contained. And undoing that lesson takes time, because it lives not just in your thoughts, but in your nervous system. There are moments when the past suddenly feels close again. A tone of voice, a lack of response, a moment where you reach out emotionally and don't receive what you hoped for. These moments can feel disproportionately painful, as if something old has been reopened. That's because emotional neglect wires your system to expect absence. When it happens again, even in small ways, it doesn't just hurt in the present, it echoes backward, touching every time you felt unseen as a child. This isn't weakness. It's memory stored in the body. You may also struggle with receiving care when it's offered. Compliments make you uncomfortable. Support feels undeserved. Being prioritized can trigger guilt instead of relief. Part of you still believes that emotional care must be earned, that you need to justify your needs before they can exist. So when someone shows up for you freely without being asked, it challenges the core belief you grew up with, that emotional attention is scarce and conditional. Learning to accept care is as important as learning to ask for it, and both can feel equally unnatural. You may find yourself pulling away just when someone gets closer, minimizing your feelings even as someone tries to validate them, deflecting warmth with humor or logic. These are not signs that you don't want connection. They're signs that connection was once unreliable, and your system is still protecting you from the pain of hopping too much. As you become more aware of these patterns, you may feel grief rise again, not just for the childhood you had, but for the version of yourself that adapted so deeply. The child who learned to stay quiet, the child who stopped reaching, the child who learned to regulate their emotions alone. There is a tenderness required here. That child wasn't broken. They were resourceful. They found a way to survive in an emotionally thin environment. And now, as an adult, you get to thank them and gently tell them they don't have to do it alone anymore. This is where self-compassion becomes essential, even if it feels unfamiliar. Not the surface-level kind that sounds like positive affirmations, but the deeper kind that allows you to sit with your discomfort without judgment, to acknowledge your pain without comparing it, to recognize that emotional neglect shaped you, even if it wasn't intentional, even if your parents did their best with what they had. Understanding context doesn't erase impact, and healing doesn't require blame, it requires honesty. Over time, you may notice your emotional range expanding. You feel sadness more clearly, but also joy. You feel anger more directly, but also relief. Emotions stop blending into a dull background noise and start becoming distinct signals again. This can feel overwhelming at first, like turning the volume up after years of quiet. But it's also a sign that you're reconnecting with parts of yourself that were muted, not missing. You begin to build emotional safety internally. You check in with yourself instead of ignoring signals. You notice when something doesn't feel right and take it seriously. You learn that discomfort doesn't mean danger and need doesn't mean weakness. Slowly, you stop outsourcing your emotional worth to others. You stop waiting for someone else to validate what you already feel. You become more anchored inside yourself. This shift doesn't make life painless. You will still feel loss, disappointment, and loneliness at times, but the difference is that you no longer face those feelings alone. You don't abandon yourself the way you once learned to. You stay, you listen, you respond, and that changes everything. Because emotional neglect hurts most when it teaches you that no one will come, not even you. And this is the quiet truth at the heart of it all. What made emotional neglect so painful wasn't just the absence of others. It was the absence of yourself that followed, the disconnection from your inner world, the belief that your feelings were optional. Healing is the process of revering that belief, of reclaiming your emotional life, of learning, slowly and imperfectly, that you were always worthy of attention, care, and understanding. That is why it sucks to be emotionally neglected as a child. Not because it defines you forever, but because it leaves you with invisible work to do later in life. Work that others may never see. Work that requires patience, courage, and gentleness. But in doing that work, you don't just heal old wounds, you build a relationship with yourself that was delayed, not denied. And when you finally begin to show up for your own emotions, consistently, kindly, without conditions, something profound happens. The emptiness no longer controls you. The past loosens its hold. And the child who once learned to survive without emotional presence finally learns what it feels like to be held, understood, and emotionally safe. From the inside out, and when you reach this point in the journey, something important becomes clear. You were never broken. You were never too sensitive, too quiet, or too distant. You were responding to an environment that didn't know how to respond to you. Emotional neglect doesn't damage you in loud, obvious ways. It shapes you quietly, teaching you how to survive without emotional reassurance. And survival, even when it looks calm on the outside, always comes at a cost. There may still be days when the old patterns resurface, days when you pull back instead of reaching out, days when you feel empty without knowing why, days when you question whether your emotions are valid at all. Healing doesn't erase these moments, it gives you a different relationship with them. Instead of panicking or shutting down, you begin to recognize them as echoes, not truths. Reminders of where you came from, not indicators of where you're going. You stop demanding perfection from yourself. You stop expecting emotional fluency overnight. You allow yourself to learn slowly, imperfectly, humanly. You begin to understand that emotional growth was delayed, not denied, and that delay was never your fault. It was the result of growing up without emotional guidance, without someone consistently showing you how feelings could be met with care instead of silence. As this understanding settles in, something inside you softens. You become less harsh with yourself, less rushed, less ashamed of needing reassurance, connection, or rest. You begin to see your emotional needs not as inconveniences, but as signals, important messages from a part of you that was once ignored and is now finally being heard. This is where the story quietly changes. You stop looking back only with pain and start looking forward with compassion. You realize that while you didn't get what you needed then, you are capable of giving it now. Not perfectly, not all at once, but consistently enough to make a difference. You become the presence you once searched for in others. And that is the most powerful part of healing from emotional neglect, reclaiming your emotional life, learning to feel without apologizing, learning to connect without abandoning yourself, learning to trust that your inner world deserves attention, care, and patience. These are skills you build, not traits you were born without. So yes, it sucks to be emotionally neglected as a child. It leaves invisible wounds. It creates confusion, emptiness, and self-doubt that can follow you for years. But it does not define your ending. It does not mean you are incapable of deep connection, self-understanding, or emotional safety. It simply means your journey started differently and required you to grow in ways others may never fully see. And as you continue that journey, one quiet truth remains. The moment you begin to consistently show up for your own emotions with honesty, patience, and care, you start to become the safe place you needed all along. And at the very end of this understanding, there is a kind of quiet relief that settles in, not because the past suddenly stops mattering, but because it finally makes sense. You stop asking yourself why you struggle with things that seem easy for others. You stop wondering why closeness feels confusing, why emotions feel heavy, why self-doubt appears even when nothing is wrong. You realize that these were never personal failures. They were adaptations, logical responses to an emotional environment that didn't teach you how to be held. You begin to see your life with softer eyes. The moments you pulled away weren't because you didn't care. The numbness wasn't because you were cold. The independence wasn't because you didn't need anyone. All of it was learned in a time when needing more felt unsafe or pointless. And once you understand that, shame starts to loosen its grip. You stop fighting yourself for being the way you are, and instead, you begin to work with yourself. There is no dramatic finish line in healing from emotional neglect. No moment where everything clicks and the past disappears. What happens instead is quieter, steadier, and more real. You notice yourself pausing instead of suppressing. You notice yourself speaking up a little sooner. You notice that you no longer disappear the moment something feels emotionally uncomfortable. These changes may seem small, but they are profound. They mean you are no longer abandoning yourself the way you once had to. And maybe that is the most important shift of all. You stop waiting for someone else to finally notice you, understand you, or emotionally rescue you. Not because you don't want connection, but because you are no longer empty without it. You have learned how to stay with yourself, how to listen, how to respond, how to care, in ways you were never shown but always deserved. This is why emotional neglect hurts so deeply, and why healing from it is such a courageous act. Because you are not just undoing the past, you are teaching yourself, piece by piece, how to live emotionally present in a world that once felt distant. And every time you choose to acknowledge your feelings instead of dismissing them, every time you stay instead of shutting down, you are quietly rewriting the story. Not into a perfect one, but into an honest one. One where you are finally allowed to exist, fully, emotionally, and without apology.